Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with David Shedd on the ODNI at 20 years, for better or for worse. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence. We have a great guest today to talk about the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who was really indeed present at its creation. David R. Shedd served in the U.S. government in a wide variety of national security and intelligence positions for nearly 33 years. In August 2014, he was named Acting Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, following 4 years of service as DIA's Deputy Director. Until January 2015, he led the Defense Intelligence Enterprise workforce comprising more than 16,000 military and civilian employees worldwide. From May 2007 to August 2010, Mr. Shedd served as the Director of National Intelligence Deputy Director for Policy Plans and Requirements. Prior to that, he served in several capacities in the Office of the DNI, the White House's National Security Council, CIA, and in U.S. embassies abroad. Since leaving the federal government in February 2015, Mr. Shedd has served as Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and was an adjunct professor teaching relationship between intelligence and national security at Patrick Henry College until the end of 2022. He works as an independent national security consultant, serves on 8 public and nonprofit corporate boards, including 2 Christian colleges, and works with several international mission and NGOs, such as Gospel Mission of South America, Justice and Mercy International, and Samaritan's Purse. David, welcome to our program today. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
And I mentioned President at the Creation, the great memoir title of Dean Acheson. I was thinking of that when I was looking at your bio, and it seems like a good way for us to start. So the act which created the ODNI, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, 2004, was voted in this month in October 2004 and signed into law in December 2004. So really, this apple of the Congress's eye was created 20 years ago, and the ODNI was finally kicked off in early 2005, right? I think April. And so you were there. So let's start with that. What was the challenges faced there? And then we can get into a little bit of the overview 20 years later on what we see as the big successes and maybe areas for improvement, as we like to say.
Well, thank you, Michael, again, for the privilege, and Peter for setting this up, and to your audience. And it is a real privilege to be able to talk 20 years, which I would say is closer to 20 and a half years, since really the discussion in earnest about the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 began in all seriousness around the late spring, midsummer of 2004, as the intelligence community had been studied multiple times by external panels and commissions and outside reviewers, oftentimes or virtually in no instance ever coming to agreement on the kinds of reforms. And it reminds me that oftentimes reforms come about as a result of external or exogenous events. In this case, clearly the 9/11 Commission report was the genesis for driving this, along with the political year that 2004, which very interestingly is timed with the elections that we are in now, in having the president to take a position on what to do about intelligence reform in the summer, or like I said, early spring or late spring of 2004. And so George W. Bush went along with and supported then what became the Intelligence Reform Act signed into law in December of 2004. So the predicate for it was several things. The crisis du jour of the day was how to bring together foreign and domestic intelligence into a cohesive picture for the decision maker, be it the president, be it law enforcement, be it the warfighter on the battlefield, wherever that might be. Remember, at the time, we had been attacked on 9/11, 2001. We had gone to war in March of 2003 in Iraq. By the end of 2003, it was quite evident that there was a second intelligence failure associated with the absence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So not only had there been the failure to identify the attacks of 9/11, in where domestic intelligence or information was held by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the Central Intelligence Agency abroad in its collection, and the two never met together in terms of identifying the plots and the threats associated with those horrific events of 9/11, 2001. So that's the predicate, and I think it's very important for you, the audience in general, to understand why a DNI was established, or the position was created, in addition to the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, because we needed to find a way to bridge this foreign collection and capabilities that, of course, had a long history post-World War II, emanating in the case of CIA from the OSS into becoming the Central Intelligence Agency, but with a domestic component where our adversaries now, as non-state actors, blurred the lines between the frontiers, if you will, the borders, if you will, of coming inside America and attacking us in a manner that we had not seen since Pearl Harbor. And it was judged to be an intelligence failure from the standpoint of not identifying how to do that and get that effort done. Because of the obvious sensitivities, and rightly so, of the American people, and this now becomes really important, Michael, to cross the divide between foreign and domestically collected information, there really wasn't any way to square a circle of having the Director of Central Intelligence, who really, for all intents and purposes, was viewed as predominantly focused on running the CIA, now have a charge or a overseer role over the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the domestic intelligence that was collected. So therefore, you had to think about a different construct that separated the DCIA, the director of CIA, and the director of FBI into an architecture that brought independence to that construct. And that's really then what was stood up in April of 2005 as the execution, if you will, of IRTPA, of the Reform Act, became practical with the first Director of National Intelligence, with a longstanding foreign policy expert and ambassador and consumer of intelligence in John Negroponte, and a principal deputy who had run NSA, the National Security Agency, in Michael Hayden, General Hayden at the time, now retired. And so that role became, that combination of those two were the answer to that problem of crossing or finding a bridge across the big chasm between foreign and domestic intelligence, the sharing component of that, and then the integration of that information, which was perhaps most visibly seen in the now statutorily created National Counterterrorism Center in Northern Virginia today, and it has been quite effective.
Right, and that may be one of the, the singular initial achievements was NCTC and being able to get that up and running quickly and making a contribution then the 2000s and on the rest of the battle in the global war on terrorism. So let's talk a little bit more about what that took. Just getting how something like this would staff up, and where do you find the people to do it? And then what was other priorities considered at the time that they needed to have some more direct oversight standpoint of the ODNI?
Well, it's interesting. What created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was legislation that by no means was perfect. And I'm happy to sort of pull the thread on that with some separate discussion, but let's not go there right now.
Mm-hmm.
To inherit legislation that creates something that is perhaps not ideal, but the outcome of a legislative process. President signs it into law. What the ODNI inherited is a community management staff that used to work for the Director of Central Intelligence. With the creation of the DNI, the DCI position goes away and now is vested in this person that we call the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence. He or she then inherits as the DNI this community management staff, but a whole new set of responsibilities aimed at, as I've already mentioned, driving integration. At the time, I believe 16 agencies of the intelligence community, today 18, I believe, into an architecture of greater information sharing, greater resiliency to the challenges to the budget, ups and downs in terms of finding common efforts that would be, for example, in the IT world and all of that, to find commonality and to drive it as an entity. And I often, in standing it up, often think of a model of a DNI having some equivalency to a chairman or a chairperson of a board of directors. And the members of that board are those 18 agencies. Not all created equal, because we're not going to say a DIA or an NSA or a National Geospatial Agency is of equal weight as State Department's small unit of intelligence called INR in the Intelligence and Research Bureau. But they have a seat at the table. And those members are the equivalent of presidents and CEOs of their entity, if you will, to draw that somewhat analogy there. The struggle was in defining where the lines would be drawn between what a DNI would instruct those agencies to do and what it could cajole those agencies into doing. And it took a great degree of trust, and none of it would have been possible in standing it up, going back to your original question, were it not for the impetus and trust and confidence placed into the first DNI and principal deputy by the President of the United States. Why? Because, as I already said, the legislation was imperfect. It had quirks to it that kind of didn't define what coordinate means.
Right.
If the president says, thou shalt, as an element of my executive branch, do this, you have an executive order, or you certainly have the impetus of the president's words to go and do that, because they're all serving in the executive branch. So it was vital then, and 20 years later, it is absolutely vital that any director of national intelligence have that support from the President of the United States, because it's in that Oval Office that the DNI gets his or her authority ultimately to act with what otherwise would simply be either viewed as the peers or worse yet, the underlings of the agency over which the particular director is CEO and president and CEO over that entity. I don't know if that sort of
Yeah,
explains
yeah.
the divide.
There's a few things that we should touch on. One is, first of all, the reaction from the established agencies, especially the heavyweights, and the pushback. I mean, there was a certain, and the resistance to having a new supra bureaucracy to oversee them. You saw that from early on when it was established. How was that overcome or at least coped with? And do we still see certain degree of legacy of that?
Well, time begins to heal many things. They don't heal everything because there's scar tissue at times. And I would say 20 years later, there is scar tissue to the very question that you asked. But let me go back to the beginning. The resistance, and it's often pinned on CIA exclusively. And I have to tell you, from a firsthand observer at the time, it wasn't delegated or relegated to the CIA alone. The combat support agencies, those would be those large agencies inside the Defense Department that operate under different authorities, as well as being a member of the intelligence community, such as DIA, which I helped lead then in 2010 to 2015, NSA at Fort Meade, and NGA, as well as the National Reconnaissance Office. Those big ones that carried preponderance in budget and people resisted under the now long departed and has passed away Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. And that resistance was very real in terms of creating, for example, a model in which there had been a Department of Intelligence created. He said under no circumstances would he support that for one simple reason. We were at war both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he would have to create the capabilities that those combat support agencies would have to deliver to the warfighter in real time and in first priority. Meanwhile, CIA resisted, and then there was a huge demand of a cultural shift in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in the 56 field offices who were used to collaring criminals, that were used to going after the counterintelligence elements of the foreign threat, but not counterterrorism, not the intelligence collection mission that the Intelligence Reform Act gave them as a member of the intelligence community. So you had different pockets of resistance. And the one thread I will tell you that ran pervasively through all of them is culture. It's very hard to change culture of any organization, and that did not come as a surprise then to a DNI who found resistance to the creation of this new office that sadly, and maybe somewhat till this very day, see it among these other large agencies as a zero-sum game. If the DNI as principal intelligence advisor is that person with that access to the president, it must mean that it 100% takes that away from me rather than the collaboration. And this will strike your audience as, I think, strong common sense. Its personalities matter. And so when you have these seniors working together, that was tended to be the biggest solution to driving the cultural changes of resistance to the creation to that. Where have we come to today? Fast forward, there is a foregone conclusion that the office of the DNI is not going away. That's it. It's not going to be delegislated. Nothing, or rarely is anything ever delegislated. So it's here to stay. Two, if you can't beat them, you join them. So there's an element of find a modus vivendi with the ODNI by the large agencies. And so you get a sense that there is a move now into a new status quo of having this role play. The danger, and I'll close with this on your question, the danger with that, of course, is that it becomes complacent once again, and the DNI is not driving the very original intent for which it was created, because you just kind of do it to get along.
Right, and that's integration, right? I mean, that's really, I mean, that's the original intent, sharing, integration. Let me ask a question. Something you raised a few times is the personality, and the DNI as in a really chairman of the board type role, right? With, say, NSA or CIA being more CEOs, right? They're operational. What is we've seen numerous DNI. Some of them only lasted a year, really, until I guess General Clapper stabilized it for about 7 years, I think. But what is the right personality type for a role like this? How does that work? You'd want, I mean, it seems like there was other thoughts that this would be a stronger leader at first, but hadn't been given the authorities to really do so. What have we seen over the last 20 years on what that personality type what personality type is required for a role like this?
I like to think of it as a team with a leader at top that is comfortable with collaboration and finding or developing those capabilities that promote that collaboration. What do I mean by that? I feel that the one and only dream team for the ODNI occurred 20 years ago.
Mhm.
You had this perfect match between a director of national intelligence in Ambassador Negroponte, who had served in the White House at the NSC, multiple service points as ambassadors from Mexico to Honduras to Iraq right before the naming as DNI, the Philippines, and so on and so forth, since 1961. So you had a consumer of intelligence who'd kind of seen it all. Then you had, and someone who had to solve problems in chanceries around the world at the NSC, and no small feat, Iraq. Just giving you a profile of someone that would be a chief executive officer of an embassy in the NSC, who would drive the policy community to work together on the priorities of the president. You had a deputy or principal deputy in Mike Hayden, who was an execution fellow. He was someone driven to identify and knew the intelligence community inside and out. Having served, I believe it was 3 or 4 years at NSA as a 4-star, he had now really captured the essence of what it was that worked and did not work in the intelligence community from an implementation standpoint, by focusing on what would bring greater collaboration, what would bring that. So the tandemness of those two, to me, was the dream team. Then someone like myself, who came in because of both the policy and operational exposure at the second tier level, could drive then, for example, the establishment of these senior manager jobs around analysis, or see to it that they were established, so that the prioritization against the intelligence priorities that the president had and the national security apparatus had in terms of collection and analysis were properly sort of brought together to maximize their effectiveness. And the other part was someone who was comfortable with and would help promote the writing of new policies for it. And in that case, let me just highlight that a principal document that would sort of tuck underneath the Intelligence Reform Act was the reform and the changes that had to be made to Executive Order 12333, which had not been altered since the Reagan era in the early 80s. So you think that then, and for the audience, think of this executive order as then your roadmap with the proper identification of who is responsible for what under our IRTPA for execution of the new law. And that brought clarity to it. It was a year-plus process to get there in terms of closing on EO 12333 in July of 2008, but it gives you an idea of the value proposition of a DNI when it came to driving these policies that needed to be updated and adjusted to the new law and the authorities given to a DNI.
Let's talk a little bit about how, the ODNI, it was established. And I think one of the concerns was we don't want to be building a sprawling bureaucracy to overlook the ISC, right? They wanted to cap the number of people that could be permanent hires, I think. I think that's still the case. And they were going to rely a lot on rotational positions to fill important spots. This became something of we were talking before as a gold, water, nickels for the intelligence community. Can you discuss, David, a little bit of the importance of that and how that's perhaps shaped the ODNI culture?
I believe, Michael, that it is imperative that the ODNI be a mixture of, we call them cadre, careerist, I think would be a better word for it in terms of serving in ODNI. Why? They provide continuity, they provide the history on all sorts of issues having to do with the build of the National Intelligence Program budget across the agencies, allocation of what's worked and not worked now over the 2-decade program or the DNI's longevity. But I think it is equally, if not more important, to have rotational people. These are individuals who already serve under the rubric of a particular agency, in my case, CIA, to come and have this joint duty. And for the audience, when we talk about Goldwater Nichols, this was passed so that the DoD flag officer, before making flag and additional promotions, had to serve in a service outside of their original service. So the Navy had to serve in the Air Force or in a joint duty position in order to do it. Why do I put such emphasis on this? 3 reasons. 1, they bring a different perspective. 2, they go back to their home agencies once the rotation's done with an understanding of what the left and the right can do from other agencies' perspectives as well. And 3, I think it proves over time to be an effective tool or instrument for growing that individual as an officer. The perspective that they bring, in my case, serving 4.5 years in the National Security Council staff, both as a director and then senior director, gave me an opportunity to see how State Department solves its problems or what DoD does to solve policy issues that I would have no idea if I'd never left my particular original agency. So in many ways, akin to that, the ODNI can do that from that standpoint. Why? Because they're serving alongside other detailees, that is, assignees from other agencies and departments. So, Michael, I come down on that it needs to be a healthy blend. Where exactly that bright line is between the careerist that sits there and sort of says, let me remind you, we've always done it this way. That's an issue. And the rotational ones, I think that's, again, a leadership issue for the DNI and the top echelon to make sure that that blend occurs in the right mix.
Everybody who's listening, please offer your questions in the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll get to them shortly. Dave, one thing we wanted to talk about too, and looking at sort of the legacy, one thing that was a big emphasis under General Clapper was the establishment of the mission manager concept. And obviously you had a close eye on that, how that developed. There's 17 mission managers, I think, now. What was the idea behind that? And was this something that was something that had to be done? Was it a good working model?
I'll start with the last part of your question. Is it a good working model? I believe it is. Did it have to be done? There's a call out in the Reform Act to do something akin to that, and you have to go back to the letter of the law. But in essence, the reason it's a good idea is that it brings focused attention to particular topics, transnational, geographic, or some blend thereof. I mean, sometimes they're both, and the allocation of resources. We all know we live in the community, the intelligence community is no different, lives in a world of finite resources. To the audience, that may seem trite and seem as though I'm whistling in the wind when we talk about 100,000 total in the IC and a $70 billion, 80 billion when you do the national intelligence program with the military intelligence program combined. It's a lot of resources, but most of them are spoken for. That's the thing. So the allocation and through these mission managers then is the ability for the Director of National Intelligence working with his board, if I keep the analogy going of the business side, to identify where the plug and play needs to occur in the year of execution. Do we need to uplift a certain particular target with additional resources, dollars and people, or one or the other or both, to place greater emphasis on it? Why? Because the president has said so, or because the national security intelligence priorities didn't identify that as a key issue. So I'll give you an example. A mission manager that might be looking at the impact of China vis-a-vis COVID and Wuhan labs and all of that. 2019, who would have ever thought? But it wasn't a topic. But in 2020, when you start looking at what's required to better understand that, and with contributions from the National Intelligence Council that you know so well and other elements, there had to be a concerted effort to understand, where did this come from? Are we going to face it again? What do we do about it in terms of bio and that sort of thing? So all of a sudden there's a surge, if I can use that word, that a mission manager can get behind based on either the conditions of the day, the priorities of the president, or all the above.
One thing I wanted to ask, I want to get to our questions, but before I lose the train of thought here. The relationship between the DNI and the president, as you mentioned to begin, is a very important one. What role does the DNI play in the major appointments to the agencies? Is it an advise and consent role, or is there a role at all?
It depends. You have to go into the law itself. There is an advise and consent virtually on all of them. There are appointments, such as the Director of Central Intelligence. Now, here's the tricky part. Those ultimately all belong to the president. Appointments belong, anybody that's senatorially confirmed belong to the president. So the president can say, DNI, I still don't like who you brought up to be the Director of Central Intelligence. I have my own man or woman to fill that job. That's the president's prerogative, in my view. So I think the short answer is, to the degree, and we know how the real world works here, the DNI has a say, and particularly a dominant or strong say, the more cohesion there will be to the team. Why? Because there's a certain nexus to having been appointed with the knowing or the witting aspect of that DNI support behind it. Uh, and so this is really important for the Attorney General when it comes to the relationship with the FBI and the DNI. It's important for the Secretary of Defense when it comes to the appointees within DoD, because the services also have appointees. So I think there's 9 out of those 18 there. And then individually, the smaller ones as well. You'd want consultation with the Secretary of State over the Assistant Secretary at INR. Just giving you examples, or at Treasury, wherever these positions exist in this very broad spectrum of intelligence activities throughout the US government, in what we call the intelligence community.
Let's talk, go to some of our questions now. And Sheila raises something which I think I'm going to rephrase it a little differently. But so how do you see the public's view of the ODNI now? Does the public have a clear picture of what it is? And would you say that it is an accurate one?
Well, Sheila, that's a difficult, you have a couple questions with embedded in your question, which is a really excellent one. It's difficult to tell. I will say that in my period of serving there from the 2005 to 2010, we faced a tsunami of bad publicity about the ODNI. Let me think of descriptors: bloated, inept, unnecessary. Now, I'd never want to suggest that there was an information op going against us, but there may have been. But our response consistently was the law was passed, it was created, and we're going forward with this. Obviously, always hearing the concerns that we had in the Congress, as well as in the public view of what the ODNI was in terms of those descriptors that I gave you. I think the past 15 years, it has settled. My concern there, Sheila, would be it is settled that it kind of makes no difference then. Well, I'm not sure that that's the right place to be either. I want to see a DNI that in their annual threats report is talking to the public about a unified position and the identification where dissent exists over that position vis-a-vis our adversaries, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, as it pertains to national security. And so I'm not sure hiding the DNI is not the answer either. And I don't, and I'm not in a good position in South Florida to really determine currently if today's perspective, other than a lot of those pejorative descriptors of the ODNI that have gone away, at least I don't hear them, is that we are now in a really good place either. I don't know with the American public. I will say this in closing. I need to underscore this. There is a responsibility by the DNI to the American people to explain intelligence. We live in an open and free society in which intelligence is an element that creates a certain tension with openness. And I think a DNI who is involved in public speaking about the role of intelligence, why we need it, how it's done, while protecting both the sources and the methodology for doing so, is actually a good thing. I don't see a lot of that, but that's my perspective. But great set of questions to your big question on the ODNI.
Walker asks, what do you think is the greatest priority for ODNI to further standardize and professionalize the IC in both its civilian and military sides?
Well, Walker, I keep going back to, and Michael highlighted this with the National Counterterrorism Center. To me, it's quite a good model to follow. It provides for integration of information under one roof, literally. It provides identification of what the policymaker needs to be able to identify and potentially then result in thwarting the adversaries in terms of attacks on the United States when it comes to international terrorism. So the one thing the DNI could be doing more of, in my opinion, is creating an expansion, but of detailees under one roof, under these mission managers, for example, on China or Iran or on transnational crime. So I use some transnational issues as well. Why? Because I find it to be inefficient and, heaven forbid, unproductive to just have pockets of excellence that ought to be combined. And I think the DNI can drive that in a way that it floats everybody's intelligence community elements boat to a higher place by doing so. In other words, bring the China experts together, break down the barriers on information sharing. Don't hide behind the veneer of classification that I can't tell this other agency. By the way, to individuals who all have clearances already. I mean, this isn't public information. This is among themselves.
Right.
To do better analysis, better collection, better targeting when it comes to who are you going to go after to identify where you can get that kind of information. That would be a tremendous contribution by the DNI.
And then as you were talking, it raised a thought I had because, the Ombudsman's report back in 2021, which is Barry Zoloff's report, in fact, one of our adjuncts here. Barry, I mean, their report was clear that there was a certain cultural proclivities within the analytic units that maybe just, that resided with them. That's something that could have perhaps may have been a better way to have broadened the perspectives of the analysts on various these topics, because this was as you recall, a report on politicization. Right. So that may be one of the factors here in helping to thwart that, is essentially by getting more people, cheek by jowl, working on some of these issues together from the different agencies.
And a footnote to that, Michael, is you don't want to be in the position of, after the event, looking back and saying, I wish I had. I think that is really the message I want to give to your audience. Think about what you want today so you prevent, or at least mitigate, the failure to come, and don't have that day after go, if I'd only combined the right expertise, if I'd only made sure that the tradecraft around analysis was what it needed to be so that dissenting voices are properly heard and not suppressed in the analysis. That sort of thing. I'm not saying it's being done. I'm just saying that, to me, is an effective DNI in the role that he or she should be playing.
Jim asks about the cohesiveness of the intelligence enterprise. Has the ODNI contributed successfully to that? Is there better synergy among the parts now than there was?
Jim, I'll be very honest with you, being away from it now for a number of years. I don't know how I can characterize that today and be accurate about it. My sense is, nonetheless, that it is more cohesive. I believe that the resources drive them to greater cohesion while the world is on fire and greater demands are put upon the intelligence community, forcing collaboration. I'm not saying it's always voluntary, but it may drive it to be more collaborative and more cohesive, to use your word, Jim. Look, in the end, I think in the better for worse of the title of this conversation, I would say it's better than it otherwise would be. Are there um, partisan pockets of resistance? Of course there are. There always are in bureaucracies, and these are massive bureaucracies when we talk about the numbers that could be opposed. I think the generational changes that by virtue of being 20 years after the passage of IRTPA and the stand up a little longer than that to the ODNI, is you now have careerists who've never heard or seen anything but having a DNI. I mean, and so they go, of course we have to get this to the DNI because he or she's asked for it, and they don't resist it because it's we call it BAU, business as usual then at that point.
Right. Lloyd asked a question about politicization and how I mean, let's get back to your long career, and this is something our students bring up a lot, and maybe this isn't really an ODNI question, it's just an intelligence and the public question, is how serious an issue do you think this has been in the judging from the light of your career? And what's the best way to do something about it?
It concerns me a great deal, and it did throughout my career, particularly the latter years, that politicization, that is providing biased, underscore biased, not unbiased, biased report to support a particular policy objective and or suppress analytic views that would be contrary to the mainstream associated with a policy outcome. Um, I have examples of the good and the bad. The good would be in October of 2003. We saw that the what were known as the Sons of Iraq in Anbar province were taking a hold. These were Sunni fighters, and the war was not going well. It was difficult to go in an unpoliticized way and tell the president the really bad news. It was we were really at one point at risk of losing Iraq. He decided on a very unpopular matter, which was to increase the force presence and change tactics in Iraq as a result. And you have the post-Fallujah and all of the events of Iraq that later proved that it arrested the problem of that through unbiased intelligence that came into the president, even though it was very difficult to do. On the other hand, I've had examples of politicization where uh, you have had sort of the idea of giving the policymaker what they perhaps wanted to hear. I think at times that occurred with the hunt for UBL pre-2011 that I saw, and that they were more optimistic about being able to find him. And why? Because there was a desperate hunt for them, and we could not find it, or you found operational activities that at times were not going as well as they would be purported to be going to the policymaker as well. How do I handle it? Truth to power. You have to tell the truth and be prepared either to resign over it and or take your lumps, whether it's in the Oval Office or in the Situation Room or wherever you're delivering that intelligence. And I'm sure Michael could potentially recount other times where it's difficult to speak the truth to the power players that you're addressing at that time. Why? Because the intelligence community, like everybody else, wants to be liked as well. Well, we're not there to be liked. You're there to tell it as it is, and you're there to serve the president, and it doesn't matter what particular party he or she belongs to, and you need to deliver that even if it's difficult. And that means at times dealing with really difficult customers as well. But that comes with the territory by being unbiased. We run a great danger to politicize intelligence because at that point, we're not serving them ultimately as we should.
And we'll lose not just policymaker support, but the public's.
Oh, the public, right, and the confidence then in us
Right.
to do it well.
I want to get to Gene's question, which is on the authorities. Is the ODNI, are the authorities sufficient? Do we need amendments to IRTPA or to Executive Order 12333?
Well, Gene, let me start with the last part of your question. Absolutely, and I've talked to some, as of today, still influential people that they need to tackle EO 12333. If you read it today, which is a publicly available document, of course, you will find virtually no mention of cyber. My bad, in 2008, I didn't foresee where we were headed, and so we're 16 years out of date in terms of just the mission sets that now I would leave it to a new administration, but that can be done under the president's purview. On IRTPA, I would not reopen it. I believe the authorities are there. If you combine it with the support that I talked about earlier and that Michael endorsed in terms of the president's backing of the DNI, I will say this, that it takes a partnership with Congress as well. Don't let me leave them out. The expectation, it's interesting that since 2001, the only non-reform of any aspect of intelligence has been the Hill. There's been no changes to it. And I have often scratched my head thinking, is it really working that well when your authorizers, which of course are the intelligence oversight committees, and your appropriators, which are in the defense side, do we have that construct right? But I do think that ultimately, if they're not going to reform, the DNI has to work very closely with the Hill as well. Why? Because in the appropriations authorities, of which each of these agencies get their own appropriations still, he or she as DNI has the authority to shape that over what's called the 5-year program. So the 5-year budget, not the year of execution. Once that's passed by Congress, it's executed. However, in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, in building the budget that goes to the Office of Management and Budget and to the president ultimately and submitted to the Hill, the DNI has a not only responsibility, but the authority to shape those budgets against priority requirements. Now, in the year of execution, that's the cajoling part of these CEOs to work together to move resources in one way or another with the authorization of the Congress to do so and all of that. So it's complicated, but I think there would be high risk and it would be a high wire act to reopen IRTPA because you don't know what's going to come out the other end.
Right.
And I'm by nature a risk taker, but I'm not prepared to take
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing, and we've got a couple minutes left, but something we wanted to touch on, I wanted to make sure we had a chance to do that. After you left ODNI, you became acting director of DIA. So you were able to now see your handiwork from a distance at an important agency like DIA. What was your perspective then in a different seat?
Well, it was a sigh of relief to go to an operational agency. So that was, I'd always been an operator before going to the White House in 2001. I went as deputy director, which for your audience, any deputy director in the IC of a large agency is the chief operating officer. If you're, again, to draw the analogy to business, you are running the day-to-day. What I saw, Michael, very quickly was my ability to enjoin capabilities with other agencies that because of my ODNI experience, and the best example I can give you was working with the CIA at Langley on human and the human intelligence standpoint, which was my career, and to be able to work through a classmate of mine who happened to be the Undersecretary of Intelligence in DOD, Michael Vickers, to help build that in DIA with the collaboration of CIA and CIA offering up collaboration with DIA as an example in improving human intelligence collection by the agency and by DIA. As one example, another one, Stephanie O'Sullivan was principal deputy at the time of ODNI, and I would work out all kinds of things back channel with her in order to so you would have access to additional classified information for the analyst that otherwise a barrier would have gone up from, including by, yes, another combat agency, support agency, NSA, but also CIA on the human and signals intelligence reporting, that sort of thing. And it actually worked well for me because of that experience in ODNI. And I knew the policies inside and out since I helped write the new national intelligence directives that were coming out of what formerly had been the DCI directives, or the DCI directives. Anyway, so it became very practical, but all of a sudden I was operational again, which I thoroughly enjoyed. 4 years as the deputy and then 6 months as the acting director of DIA. Great team of men and women there.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you for being with us today for this great discussion on the ODNI at 20. And we hope to have you back soon when we're talking about your next topic of interest. And I'd like to also invite everyone to join us again on November 21st, when Ambassador John Sullivan will be our guest, who will talk about Russia's war against the West. That's on November 21st, usual at noon at Eastern Standard Time. And we also will have another Inside Intelligence event. The last of the year will be on Japanese intelligence prior to World War II and against the United States. So that'll be on December 4th. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Really enjoyed the program. Thanks for all the great questions, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.